Welcome to the Fuel Pulse Show podcast. I'm your host, Eric Bjornstad, your guide through the ever-changing world of fuel. If you haven't joined us before, the Fuel Pulse Show is for anyone who uses fuel or who has things that use fuel, whether at work or at home, and that means it's for pretty much anyone. Especially if you are a professional with a job that means taking care of or using stored fuel because you need to get the job done, whatever that job may be. So if you think that any of that sounds at least a little bit like you, then the Fuel Pulse Show podcast is for you. So what are we going to talk about today? Well, today is where we talk about something that has the potential to get into the technical weeds a little bit. So we are going to do our absolute best to keep that from happening. If you deal with stored fuel to any appreciable extent, you are eventually going to have to deal with microbial issues in that fuel, in that storage tank. And that means you're going to have to look at biocides to help get rid of that problem. So our guest today has extensive history and expertise in that area, and he's going to do us a solid, pass some of that along to us. So today, we're talking with Sean Vliet of Vink Chemical. Now, Sean is the North American business manager for Vink Chemicals US. He's responsible for business management and business development in the US and Canada markets for both downstream and upstream. And this means his area of expertise intersects with fuel biocides, oil field biocides, and H2S scavengers, among other things. Now, prior to joining Vinc, Sean had a similar role with Schulke & Mayer for about 6 years, and in the past, he also worked for Baker Hughes, another fairly prominent company, where he represented and sold terminal fuel additives, including fuel biocides. And he also has 5 years of experience with Sunoco as an area marketing manager. Now, one of the best things about Sean, apart from being an expert in a field that needs the knowledge of more experts, is Sean is a Philadelphia 76ers fan like me. So, Sean, welcome to the Fuel Pulse Show.
Thank you, Eric. It's great to be here, and certainly an honor. And I mean, I've had the opportunity to listen to a couple of the shows that you've already done. So I think it's about to take off for you. So
Well, I appreciate that.
So great to be here.
Yeah, definitely appreciate you coming on, because I know that you are a busy man these days. Now, your background is, like we said, you're a North American business manager for Vink Chemicals. Now, how long have you been with Vink?
Yeah, so I've been with Vink Chemicals for about 2.5 years. Vink Chemicals, it's an innovative family-owned chemical supplier with headquarters based out of Hamburg, Germany area. In Europe, Vink Chemicals produces and supplies technical biocides for various industrial applications used worldwide. Our product lines are technical biocides, specialty chemicals, system cleaning, and fuel and oil field treatment products. Here in the U.S., due to certain various registration issues, we primarily focus on H2S scavengers, oil field biocide, and of course the fuel biocide, which we're going to discuss.
Okay, great. And before that, you were with Schulke & Mayer, which I understand is another German company, I believe. Is that right?
Yeah, that is 100% correct. So yeah, I was with Schulke for about five to 6 years, and so Schulke divested, sold off part of its business unit to Vink Chemicals, which I was a part of, which is their technical biocides, slash oil field chemicals division. So that's how we ended up with Vink, and like I said, it's so yeah. If you had heard of Schulke and the Meyer in the past with the biocides, that's the
Okay, yeah, I
connection.
was going to ask you what made you go from one to the other, but I think you just answered that question.
Yeah, absolutely. So it was an easy transition, of course, you know.
Yeah, and
So,
so like we said, Vinc's primary business focuses. You've got the biocides, and we mentioned two kind, if you want to call it two kinds of biocides, in the little intro. Talked
hmm
about oil stream or oil. Oh, see, I did it again. I called it oil stream, oil field
yeah,
biocides,
that's
but then also
that's right.
fuel biocides. And sometimes, this is a question that referring to our audience, kinds of people who are listening to this, sometimes they may hear the terms upstream and downstream. Like they'll hear upstream oil and gas versus downstream. So when people talk
Yeah.
about that in relation to things like biocides, for example, what do they mean?
In terms of oil of upstream and
Yes.
downstream biocides, yeah. So upstream biocides will be primarily where we produce
Okay.
oil. So anytime we're drilling or we're fracking, the
Mm-hmm.
early stages of pulling oil and gas from the ground, from the earth. So biocides are used in different applications focused
Mm-hmm.
on that upstream market. So that's what we mean by upstream. And when we say downstream, it's well, let me just say sometimes midstream too. Most industry experts will consider midstream as the
Okay.
pipeline. So once oil is produced, then it's passed through pipeline, and so they consider that midstream. So downstream would be when it reaches the terminal
Mm-hmm.
to when it's refined, or excuse me, when it reaches the
Yep.
refinery, it's produced at the refinery, and then makes its way onto a terminal. That's all considered downstream.
Okay, so
So
upstream would be essentially everything before the refinery by and large. And then
correct. Yeah, I think. Yep.
downstream would be everything after it's pulled out of the ground and essentially leaves on that initial trip, if you wanted to put it that way, for simple terms.
Uh, for downstream, no, I would. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. So downstream is yeah, I guess when it
Mm-hmm.
hits the refinery and anything past that, when it gets to the end
Mm-hmm.
consumer at your local gas station, to purchase diesel or gas or
Okay.
wherever.
Okay.
So
Yeah,
yeah.
and it's interesting though. The reason I bring up those questions is that
Mhm,
some of the things like we do in my role with my company Bell, we formulate different kinds of fuel treatments, and one thing as you're in the industry, one thing you realize is that certain kinds of treatments or additives, whatever you want to call them, they tend to get used more in certain sectors, in certain areas.
mhm,
And so, like for H2S scavengers, one of the things that you specialize in, that is something that you're not going to find a fleet manager or a consumer driver
right.
using that because it's used, but you do upstream oil and gas or midstream even, right? They tend to
hmm
use quite a lot of those, and they have to because, as I understand it, H2S is something that you don't want to be
hmm
around.
That is correct. Yep. And we want to eliminate as much of that as
Yeah.
possible. That's for sure.
So for biocides, and one reason why I bring this up is, sometimes it's useful for people to kind of make that realization. And what I'm talking
hmm
about is sometimes when you're kind of focusing on one area of business, say
hmm
in the downstream market, which is where a company like
hmm
Bell Performance is concentrating on. We do all of our work with all the downstream people and the end users. Um, and so
hmm
one of the things that we have done a lot of work with are biocides. And
hmm
if you didn't have the broader perspective of what was going on in the broader industry at large, you might make the mistake of thinking that fuel biocides, let's say biocides being used to control microbes in storage tanks at municipalities or at utilities and places like that, you might make the mistake of thinking that that's the kind of the biggest slice of the pie. But that's
Right.
actually, from what I understand, one of the really smaller slivers of that pie, and that biocides,
Yeah.
there's a whole heck of a lot more biocides used upstream and in those
Mhm.
the upstream oil and gas than is used in the downstream market. Am I right?
Yeah, that is 100% correct. Yes. I mean, yeah, we sell and we try to sell our biocides in the upstream market, and like I said, during production, during fracturing. I mean, think
Mm-hmm.
about it, all the amount of water that they're pumping down into high temperature downhole.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of opportunity for microbial growth down there, and obviously a lot of biocides being used. So yeah, they have to fit a certain characteristic, and people look at biocides as what works best for
Mm-hmm.
certain situations, and that's where sales comes in to try and figure out where your biocides performance fits best. So like anything
Yeah, yeah.
else.
Let's talk about that a little bit. So, biocides is a class of fuel treatments, if you wanted to call them that.
Hmm.
What makes biocides unique among the different types of fuel treatment chemistries? Is it basically because they're designed to kill living things?
Yeah, that is correct, and then that is probably the biggest difference between other
Hmm.
fuel additives out there. And as a result of that, it's heavily
Hmm.
regulated by the
Yep.
EPA, and so that is by far the biggest difference that separates it is the fact that it's governed by or excuse me, it's heavily regulated by the EPA.
Yeah,
So.
and
Mm.
not just the EPA, but I mean, like since we're talking about regulations,
Mhm.
if a company wants to formulate a biocide and bring it to market, like you're alluding to, there's a bunch of
Mhm.
regulatory hurdles that they have to jump over slash through, and it's because biocides kill things, and so the government
Yeah.
has a pressing interest in making sure that it's effective, but also that the testing and the safety data is all in order, that it's properly classified as to where and how, also very importantly, how you can use it. We'll talk about that maybe a little bit later on. Um, and so you have to register this biocide with the EPA's division or Office of Pesticides. But then, if you also want to sell it to end users in different states, you also have to register it in different states, and you can only sell it in states that it is registered in. And there's not a lot of people know that because they're used to seeing, right, whatever they want is available everywhere. But that's not always the case
Right.
for something like biocides.
Yeah, no, that is correct, and everything you said was correct. And yeah, I mean, think at it from a chemical supplier like Vinc. If they want to introduce a new fuel
Mm-hmm.
biocide to the U.S. market, I mean, before you do that, you obviously have to, understand that there's going to be, a huge time
Mm-hmm.
investment in testing and getting this approved by the EPA. And there's also a big financial investment involved as well, because it's not inexpensive
No.
to have these tests done and apply with the registration fees and all of that. So as a result of that, there aren't many fuel biocide products in the U.S. market or even in the Canadian market.
Well, there's even fewer in the European
And it
market, correct?
Yeah, absolutely, yes, that's correct. So yeah, I mean, I guess you can look at it as an opportunity too. If you get in, you make the investment, then it is a big hurdle for other chemistries to come into the marketplace. So that's one way of looking
Well,
at it.
and that speaks
Yeah.
to talking about the kind of hurdles that have to be jumped over in order to have a biocide approved. One thing I that makes me think of are on the in the downstream market, where there's tremendous competition for these, fuel additives, multifunction fuel additives, and all these fuel additives
Hmm.
that claim to do, whatever it is that they think you want to hear. And
Right.
when you talk about making what they call biocidal claims, product claims
Hmm.
of controlling microbes, that's heavily, or it's supposed to be heavily regulated. You're not supposed
Yeah.
to be able to just bring any kind of fuel additive out to the marketplace and say, oh yeah, this will kill microbes in your fuel and eliminate microbial problems.
Mm.
Um, if you're going to make that kind of claim, you're going to have to essentially register it as a biocide. And so
Right.
one of the things that I tell people who have stored fuel, people that who might be some of our customers or some of the people that we advise on a technical basis, and they say, how can I tell if something is legitimate? How can I tell if a fuel additive is legitimate? Because they don't know any better. They're they're
Sure.
taking product claims at face value. And if they're looking for
Mm.
something that's a biocide, what I say is, if the product labeling doesn't have an EPA registration number on it and an EPA
Hmm.
establishment number on it, two numbers displayed prominently on the labeling, then that means it's not registered as a biocide, which means, I don't know how much you want to say about illegality, but it's not really legal to sell it for what they're claiming it to be.
Yeah, that is correct. And, they are, it's something they have to consider. You can be fined for using product that is incorrect and hasn't been
Hmm.
registered by the EPA. So that's something you want to take note of course. Yeah.
Absolutely. Not to mention the fact
Yeah.
that if you're using it with the expectation it's going to do something and it's not registered,
Yeah.
then you're going to have that whole problem of it's not actually going to do what you want it to do, and that problem that you have is just going to keep multiplying. No pun intended.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay.
That's
Yeah.
correct. Absolutely.
So, you said a couple minutes ago there's not that many biocide chemistries out there, and partly
Right.
because there's only so many things that will kill microbes to the extent that you can register them and sell them as some and market them as something to kill
Yeah.
microbes in a place like fuel. So
Right.
let's speak a little bit about some of the different, I guess, the common biocide chemistries out there. And we probably would refer to them by their chemistry names and not necessarily by their trade names, because there are
Hmm.
lots of different trade names that are just basically different versions of the same biocide chemistry, right?
That's correct. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, I look at it as, I guess there's like four or five other different chemistry types out there. And as I said, in the U.S. market, there really hasn't been another entry into the U.S. market except for ours. So we just received our EPA registration about 6, 7 years ago in the United States. So I think that was the
Mm-hmm.
first chemistry in a long time for the United States market to receive a new technology. Even though it was new, this chemistry has been around for, God, the last
Mm-hmm.
45, 50 years in Europe, and it's considered the go-to fuel biocide in the European market. So, it has been widely used and it's been successful, and the tests are very strong and all of that. So, so from that end, it's a great new chemistry for the U.S. to give customers another option, of
Well,
course. So,
and for the what I'll call the MBO chemistry, um, it's got some, shall we say, distinct advantages in other areas besides just how well it kills different kinds of microbes, which killing microbes is the most important thing. And not just
sure.
killing microbes, but killing as broad a spectrum of microbes as possible, because isn't it right that not all biocides are equally effective at killing all the different kinds of microbes? So there can be
Right.
differences.
Yeah, that is correct. That is correct. And so it's important to have a fuel biocide that can kill, most, if not all, microbes that may be in a fuel system. And some of them do not do
Hmm.
that, and some of them do. And MBO
Or
does that. So,
if they do that, it requires a significantly higher treat rate in order to do it, because
right,
we speak in generalities here, but when you start digging into the weeds of the microbial world, I mean, you there's so many different kinds of microbes, different classes of microbes, and you don't know exactly what's in a given fuel system that may be contaminated. So
hmm,
if you're going to treat it with biocide, right, you're going to use what you assume to be a broad spectrum one, but not all situations are
correct,
exactly the same. And so uh, in terms of how much are you going to have to use, uh,
right,
you all biocides have a kind of a what I would call a default or a stock, maybe like a shock treat or whatever nomenclature they use. And I think that comes from kill study data, that to kind of give them the greatest chance of killing the most number of microbes. But there may be situations
hmm,
where it doesn't kill all of them, um,
right.
because in the end, you don't know how heavily infected a system might be.
Yeah, that is correct, and that's why it's important to test
Hmm.
beforehand to see what you're up against, and to figure out, what is your best solution to fix the problem. So,
So, so let's talk about testing, since you brought that up, because I think you're exactly right that testing, microbial
mhm,
testing, is one of those things that is really overlooked. Um, it's not overlooked, I can guarantee, in the upstream, in the
right.
fracking and when they're pulling it out of the ground, they're not overlooking testing, but the folks downstream, not so much. But like you said, it is important,
Right.
right? Because how do you know if you've solved the microbe problem if you don't test?
Absolutely. It's something you continuously need to do to just to see what you have in there. And I think Corey
Mm-hmm.
Agnew from Guardian a few podcasts back was discussing this very topic, and the importance of testing
Mm-hmm.
frequently, and even more importantly, to get on a preventative maintenance situation where you're using a little bit at a time, but you're keeping all the problems away, until, unfortunately, if you don't have this preventive maintenance, and one day you'll have a big issue, which will be very costly, and you'll have to use, obviously, a large amount of product, plus
Mm-hmm.
clean the tanks, and things like that. So yeah, testing is very important to continuously do it as much as you can, just to stay on top of it. And it should be part of your housekeeping routine, of
Well, and
course. So,
if you test routinely, and this is something that we will advise people that we're consulting with. So I completely agree with you
mhm,
that ideally the best case scenario, especially for if you're like in a hospital or someplace where it's really
right,
important for you not to have microbially contaminated systems, especially when let's say you've got a joint commission inspection coming up. Um,
mhm,
you If you test regularly, then not only can you monitor your microbial levels, but you can also establish what they call a control interval for the given
mhm,
a tank or system, wherever it is that you're testing for. And when someone asks, what's a control interval, um, I kind of circle back to this concept that every system is a little bit different. You can make
mhm,
generalities about what it's going to be like in a underground storage tank in the state of Florida where we're at, or an above ground
mhm,
storage tank at a municipality in Pennsylvania, where close to where you're
mhm,
at. But they're all different, and each one of them, microbes grow differently in different kinds of systems, and so you can rely on generalities to make conclusions about your specific system, or if you do microbial testing on a regular basis, what you can do is you can figure out about how long it takes to develop a microbial problem in your tank.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. It's not, what I do for the most part, testing. We supply the chemical. We provide some
Hmm.
testing, more testing support on the actual chemistry itself, but we're not actually in the field, not as much as you and
Yeah.
your company is, to have a really good understanding of what you do. And so, yeah, I really can't add too much to that. So, from a field's perspective, yeah.
Yeah, so going back to the biocide chemistry, okay, so you've got
Hmm.
MBO, and
Yeah.
I was starting to say that, and that in addition to being broad spectrum, which is the number one thing that you're looking
Right.
for, whether
Hmm.
it's MBO, whether it's one of the other biocide chemistries that are considered to be broad spectrum, like there's thiocyanate, there's nitromorpholin,
Hmm.
there's isothiazolone. Um,
I
or I think they might call it CMIT/MIT. And there's also the
Right.
diboronane. Those are considered a broad spectrum. They're not all equally good, but they're all, by and large broad spectrum.
Right.
So MBO is broad spectrum like those are. But one thing that I think is really good about the MBO chemistry are the couple of key features of it that the other ones don't all have. And the first one is that it doesn't contribute any sulfur to uh,
Yeah.
the system.
Yeah, that is correct. Some of the other chemistries you mentioned contain sulfur. MBO does not, which is a great feature. And obviously, with the introduction of ULSD, from
Yep.
2006, I believe it was. Obviously, it's very important to keep the sulfur levels very low. And when you're adding fuel additives, you want to make sure that you have a limited amount of sulfur that you're adding to the system, because you don't want to obviously go above that threshold. So yeah, you can feel safe knowing that when you are using this fuel biocide MBO, that you'll contribute, zero sulfur. So.
Yeah, I know that diboronane's another one that doesn't contain any sulfur.
Hmm.
Um, uh,
Right.
Nitromorpholin and isothiazolone. Isothiazolone has some, a small, relatively small amount.
Yeah.
Thiocyanate also has some. Um,
Right.
and for whether it's going to be a problem, the amount of sulfur that it adds, I think, really depends on whether the fuel is low turn or high turn fuel. If it's high turn
Hmm.
fuel, it probably doesn't matter, um, because even
Right.
something like a thiocyanate, um, if you've got ULSD that starts out at typically around, let's say, 4 to 6 parts per million sulfur, um, and
Hmm.
you treat it with 200 parts per million, which is kind of a stock shock dose of thiocyanate, you're going to add about let's say 4.5 ppm additional
Mm.
sulfur, which isn't going to make you go out of compliance. But
Right.
if you're a hospital that has ULSD in your tank and you don't use it, and you do multiple biocide treatments, that can be a concern, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a good point. Never thought of it from that end, but yeah, it's just another thing to worry about. And there's obviously some record keeping, some
Hmm.
extra work involved in just using a chemistry that will contribute sulfur. So,
Well,
um,
and I know that, especially since I brought up hospitals, sulfur is something that Joint Commission is really starting to key in on. Because we
mm,
work with some hospitals out there, so we hear what the kinds of things that they say. And full disclosure, not it does depend on the inspector. Some inspectors will key in on different things, but making a
mhm,
generality, there are more and more Joint Commission inspectors who are keying on the sulfur levels of the fuel that
Is that right? Yeah.
these hospitals are using. And so if that hospital is trying to get a microbial problem under control, um, it would probably be well worth their while to look at a biocide chemistry like MBO instead of
Hmm.
something, let's say, like an isothiazolone, because they don't have to worry about the sulfur.
Sure. Absolutely. Yeah. No, it makes a lot of sense, and I never looked at it from that way because I don't typically handle those situations,
Yeah.
but you do, and but no, that's very interesting to hear. Yeah.
Well, and then so I said the two things that I think are most I won't say interesting, but the two characteristics
Hmm.
of MBO that I think give it real advantages. First one's sulfur, which we just talked about. The second one is that it also functions as a corrosion inhibitor, so it can provide corrosion inhibitor protection. That, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it mimics a filming amine uh, 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 protection product, if you would.
Yeah, that is correct. So yeah, this chemistry MBO, we sell it in
Mm-hmm.
different ways as different products. Like you said, one is an H2S
Mm-hmm.
scavenger, another as a corrosion inhibitor in metalworking fluids. So yeah, so not only and also as a fuel biocide. So as you're using it as a fuel biocide, you'll get that extra anti-corrosive benefit as well. So yeah, that is 100% correct. It's definitely multifunctional.
Well,
So
and there was uh, a report that was done. I'm going to try not to give the wrong year, but I think it was around
hmm
2016. It was a report
hmm
commissioned by the EPA on microbially induced corrosion, the prevalence of
uh-huh,
it across the nation, something that the EPA really started to look
right,
into. And that's where I think we first came across this idea of having a filming amine corrosion inhibitor. Um, because
hmm
the one of the recommendations that the EPA gave in this initial report, they said they specifically recommended that people with storage tanks use a filming amine corrosion inhibitor in their tank. And so,
yeah,
and there are those kind of chemistries out there um, that you can get, the what I would call standalone chemistries. But
hmm
that's why one of the reasons why I think this MBO chemistry is really good is because it gives you that protection along with being a very effective broad spectrum biocide.
yeah, absolutely. I think you touched upon two of the key things there. That's for sure. Um, and there's certainly a few more items
Mm-hmm.
as well that kind of set it apart from from the other chemistries. One being the cold weather handling
Yes.
of the chemistry. So there are some chemicals out there that other fuel biocides that will gel up 40-degree weather
Mm-hmm.
or right above freezing. So this chemistry MBO, the pour point is negative 38 degrees
Mm-hmm.
Fahrenheit. So I think in most locations in the United States, you'll be you'll feel pretty secure knowing that this product won't gel up on you in cold weather, and you'll have no problems using it wherever you want to. Whereas with some of the others, you have that issue. So that's for
Yeah,
sure.
yeah. I remember they used to there were a couple of things that people used to think were true that I think they're finding out are
Hmm.
not. One of them was that microbes. They used to think microbes don't grow in gasoline. They've they've definitely found that not to be true. And then the other one is
Right.
they would say that microbes, if you were in cold climates, you didn't have to worry about microbes. And
Right.
to a certain extent, you've got the principle that microbes, that many, I should say many kinds of microbes grow better in warmer temperatures than colder temperatures. But there still are, am I right, plenty of species of microbes that thrive in in cold situations and will cause corrosion damage and other types of things you don't want.
Yeah, that is correct. And it's like those this idea that if it's too cold or even too hot, even in the upstream market, they think certain temperatures are too hot for microbes to grow, and they've figured out that that is not the case. So yeah, biocides are needed just about everywhere, and these microbes they're always evolving. There's new ones, growing and evolving into different organisms, and yeah,
Adapting to their
they can. Well,
environments.
that is
I
correct.
mean, it's
Yes, that is
yeah,
correct.
I
Yeah.
I think this idea that microbes won't grow in cold weather, so you don't need to worry about them. I think that came out of years past when they didn't know as much about microbiology as they do now. Um, and
Yeah.
one of the things that has always fascinated me about the microbiology field, specific to the kinds of things that we do and that you do, is people have no idea the extent of the microbial world that's out there. So like I'll do
Hmm.
training for people where I'll talk about like microbial testing, some of the things that we've already talked about, and many times I'll
Hmm.
set it up by talking about how many different kinds of microbes are out there, and the
Hmm.
fact that scientists think that there are on planet Earth there's upwards of like 1 trillion species, not
Hmm.
microbes, but species of
Wow.
microbes. And we've only identified like 10 million of them, like a fraction of a percent
Yeah.
of the stuff that's out there. So, we're finding new things all the time. And so, this
Sure.
idea that microbes didn't grow in cold weather, microbes will go anywhere and everywhere. Just not all microbes will grow everywhere, but there's always going to be something that's going to adapt,
Yeah.
right?
That is correct. I mean, in the fuel industry, there's always different problems arising in different years, and as things evolve and new products are mixed together, there are all sorts of issues that come about, and that's why fuel additives are here to fix some of those
Yep.
issues.
Yep.
So.
And that's also, so that's why because the fuels have changed. So again, speaking from the fuel standpoint, the downstream fuel standpoint, the fuels have changed, so it's much easier for microbes to grow in the fuels and in the fuel systems that they tend to reside in. Um, and so it's become pretty evident that biocides are kind of the essential thing you have to be prepared to use. But then, in order to use them properly, we go back to what you had alluded to before, which was you have to do testing. Okay, so Sean, one other thing relative to the MBO chemistry, we've talked about, in comparing it to these other chemistries, we've talked about the need for that they're all broad spectrum, although not necessarily all equally effective at the same treat rates. We talked
Mm.
about the advantages of sulfur and corrosion inhibition function, if you want to put it that way. Now, talking about treat
Hmm.
rates, um, one of the things as I understand it, that MBO has an advantage with is the treat rate. That it's pretty effective at relatively what's considered to be relatively low treat rates within the industry, right?
Yeah, that is correct. Compared to the other chemicals that are out there in the U.S., MBO has the lowest minimum treat rate that is allowable for
Mm-hmm.
use, which is 50 ppm. So again, if you're talking about a preventive maintenance
Yep.
program, which most or a lot of people with tanks, they should be on some
Mm-hmm.
sort of preventive maintenance program, and obviously from your podcast
Yep.
with Guardian
Mm-hmm.
Technologies a few shows ago, there are a lot of benefits to that. So with MBO at 50 ppm compared to some of the others, which I believe are 100 ppm, some are 150 ppm. That's a big difference of the amount of chemical that's being used. So obviously when you're using preventive maintenance program, it's good to have a chemistry that won't allow you to use too
Mm-hmm.
much, and you just got to put a little bit in, and you know that your tank's going to be safe. So that is a big plus for MBO.
Well, and I've seen kill studies talking about differences in treat rates. I've seen kill studies where you have some chemistries, like there's one kind of chemistry I think called a glutaraldehyde, where
Right.
they were inoculating fuel samples with, I believe, of fungal microbes. And it took the
Hmm.
glutaraldehyde something like 5,000 parts per million in order to get that down to a negligible level, whereas the MBO did it in, like, I don't know, 100 ppm, something like that. So
Yeah. Yep, that's correct. Yeah. So again, yeah, everything is application specific, and depending on what you're treating, where you're treating,
yep.
how you're treating it, will determine, kind of how your fuel or your biocide will use compared to other biocides. So that's why it's important to know as much as you can and get the information to kind of prescribe what biocide will work best in a
Well, and you
situation.
talk about application specific. I mean, not all biocides
Mhm.
are actually approved to be used in all types of situations, right?
That is correct. Yes. So yeah. Again, touching upon the EPA regulations, that's one thing that they do is it needs to be there needs to be a use for it, whether it's fuel or oil field, or if it's in a closed containment, it can only be used in certain situations. So, um, the EPA kind of goes through that where you cannot use it, and hence you have to follow the directions or suffer
Ah,
the
yeah.
consequences,
They
of
don't
course.
like
So
you
yeah,
using
yeah,
they only want you using them in places that they're approved. And partly because they have to have the evidence that it's going to work and that it's also going to be safe to use in that
safe,
specific.
correct.
So, the different places you could that you would find approvals or non-approvals for use would be places like uh, diesel fuel, stored diesel fuel, which obviously MBO is, and all those other ones are approved for use in. Um, is MBO approved for use in gasoline?
It is. So, yeah, gasoline and any distillate. So,
Mm-hmm.
heating oil, any heavy oil, any distillate that you're using in a closed container is how it can be used.
Yep.
So,
And then you've got
yeah,
um, things like fracking fluids, crude oil, things like that. MBO is approved for use in those as well.
yep, that is correct. So, yeah, so within our registration use, it also includes all upstream applications, in a closed
Okay.
containment, of course. So,
Okay. So yeah,
yeah.
it sounds like it's going to. There's not a whole lot of places where it can't be used. I mean, there are places like it can't be used in. I don't think it can be used in, like, to treat like wastewater situations.
Yeah, that is correct. Again, closed containment, and the EPA is big on
Hmm.
that. Either it's closed containment
Yeah,
or not.
explain closed
So,
containment.
um,
That concept.
well, closed containment being like if in a
Hmm.
tank, like a fuel tank, for example, is
Like
closed
a
containment.
vehicle fuel tank,
Whereas,
right?
yeah, correct. Or even if you're, if you're injecting chemicals into a
Okay.
well, they consider that a closed containment because obviously it can't be accessed by people, breathing,
Hmm.
touching, and things like that. So, but yeah, so I guess that's how we look
Okay.
at closed containment.
Okay. All right. Okay, well, I
Yeah.
think we've learned a lot of good things about MBO and just biocides in general. I think it's pretty clear that uh, biocide, proper usage and application of biocides is something that requires a little bit of technical know-how. So it helps if
Mhm.
you've got somebody in your corner that you can, bounce ideas off of. I mean, one thing that people will ask is how they can select, how do they know what the right biocide is for them? And I think you alluded to this kind of early on, I mean, how would somebody like, let's say it was a hospital administrator who's got stored backup fuel that he's required to have, um, and they think that they've got a microbial problem. How do they go about picking the right biocide for them?
Yeah, yeah, good question. If I were in their situation, I would reach out to companies
Hmm.
who are fuel additive experts, that that work on it on a daily basis, and have a good idea of what works and what doesn't. Because picking the right biocide is an important decision, and like I said, in a hospital situation, you need something, one that probably doesn't have sulfur,
Hmm.
or provides long-lasting protection, and so you want to pick the right biocide that kind of has that feature, or has all
Hmm.
those features to fit your own specific
Well,
situation. So yeah, I would reach out to those end user companies, those fuel additive companies that deal with this
Well, and then
situation.
for the
Yeah.
people that you
Yeah.
deal with on more the upstream area, you had talked about how
Hmm.
you will uh, help them kind of make that choice. Now they have different considerations than the hospital people.
Right.
So, what can you tell
Yeah.
us about the kind of the things that go into the decision process for those kind of people?
Yeah, so our typical customers on the upstream side is the service
Okay.
companies, the oil field service
Mm-hmm.
companies, the big Baker Hughes, the
Mm-hmm.
Halliburtons, the
Yep.
Schlumbergers, the Champion X's,
Yep.
companies like that. So, in essence, they're the chemical experts. So they know a whole lot about the chemicals themselves, and um, so we're basically just giving them a description of what our product does, and show some testing of what our chemistry does to excite them. And again, they're the ones who deal with the end users, and kind of are there on a daily basis, to kind of help with the situation, the problems that they have in the field. And so yeah, that's how it works for us.
Will
Yeah.
they ever have any information like where they will be able to get a little bit specific on, let's say, the kinds of microbes that they're detecting in a contaminated system, and then ask you for
Ye-
your recommendation?
Um, Y- the first part of your question is
Mm-hmm.
correct. Yeah, I think that they are trying to figure out what kind of issues they have, in the well. But coming to us, no. Again, like I said, the service providers are chemical experts
Mm-hmm.
themselves, and they'll vet our chemistry, and make sure they know a whole lot about it. And so they're speaking with the end
Mm-hmm.
user on a daily basis to solve their problems, and to fix all their issues that they have. And with the goal of producing as much product as quickly as
Well, and they
possible.
might
So
do their own testing as
yeah.
well. They might take what a they might have their own contamination samples, and they might get
Yeah.
a sample of MBO of formulation, and then do their own, whether it's culture plate tests or I don't know, ATP testing or something
Right.
like that. Because in the end, for anybody in that situation, the ultimate gold standard is testing where they're at with what they're trying to treat.
Yeah, absolutely. Everything is specific to that application, and that locate,
Hmm.
in that location, and a different application. So yeah, you need to figure that out. And then again, once you figure out what the problem is, it's kind of like a doctor. You kind of prescribe it with a biocide. What's the best product to use in this
Hmm.
situation? And that's pretty much what they do in some
Okay.
situations. Oftentimes they'll use the least expensive one,
Not
So
always the
again, it's
best,
it's up
but
to the correct, exactly. And that's part of the problem, and that's our challenge as salespeople. I can tell you is fixing that whole
yeah.
issue. Yes.
All right. Well, Sean,
So
you have been an outstanding guest, which we expected nothing less from you. So there you go. Final
hey, thank
question
you.
for today's episode, seeing as, like me, you are a Philadelphia 76ers fan. So the final question, this is the linchpin of the whole operation here. Uh, Who is your favorite Sixer of all time, not named Dr. J, Charles Barkley, or Allen Iverson?
Not
Yes.
named. There's three, huh? Oh
I mean, you could say Moses
gosh,
Malone,
I
I
would.
guess, but or Wilt
No, you.
Chamberlain.
Yeah, right. No, I don't. I'm way
Yeah,
too
well,
young for
yeah,
him.
same here.
Yeah, not named. Well, you didn't mention Joel
Oh
Embiid. I
yeah.
mean, obviously
Well,
he's fairly
yep.
new, and but that's too easy to give you. Yeah. Um, yeah, I'd have to say, growing up, I was a big Mo
Oh
Cheeks
yeah.
fan.
Yeah.
From the,
Yep.
the early '80s, and just something about him there, you just were attracted to him, and hope he did well. And he's coaching now in the
Yep.
league, and you see him on TV every now
Yeah.
and then, and he seems like he's highly
Well,
regarded.
he would
People
definitely
people love
he
the
would
guy. So
definitely be a good one to for an aspiring player to fashion their game around. Although even though the game has changed a little
yeah,
bit,
absolutely.
they probably want to be more like Dana Barris than Mo Cheeks.
That's a good
Yes.
name, right? I think a lot of people won't even know who
Oh,
Dana Barros is, but he was a good
yeah.
player. He was a
He was
very good
good
player.
on was it NBA when I was in college in the early 90s. That's when they had NBA jams. And I think they had the
Okay.
Philadelphia team was like, where you had 2-on-2. And Philadelphia had, I think,
Yeah.
Dana Barros and like Tim Perry or
Oh.
somebody. Yeah. Needless to say, they were not one of the strongest teams in that video game. But
Well, hey, they were great players in their
yeah,
days,
yeah,
yeah, no, it was a lot of fun. It's a lot of good
yeah.
76ers. So
Well, Sean, it has been a real pleasure having you on. Thank you so much for joining us, sharing your expertise and your perspective with us and our listening viewing audience. We really appreciate it. And in the future, maybe we can have you on again because there's still plenty more things to talk about in this arena.
absolutely, I would certainly love that. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Well, that about wraps things up for today's episode of the Field Pulse Show. Thank you so much for spending part of your day with us. Check the show notes at our website for links to everything that was mentioned in this episode. Those can be found at www.bellperformance.com. Please make sure to subscribe to this podcast in iTunes or Stitcher or wherever you happen to get your podcasts. And then last but not least, if you liked what you heard, please leave us a review of the podcast at your preferred site because that is one of the primary ways that will help people find us. So until next time, bye-bye everyone. Catch you next time at the Field Pulse Show podcast.